So, this video is experimental. Consider this the introduction to a mini series of videos. I'll be sure to give you timestamps to each major section so that you can skip to and from wherever you like. I originally conceptualized this video to be structured more like my typical comparison videos, but since I had so much to say about each game, I thought it might be a little more comprehensive if I treated each game discussion as its own video in the scripting process. So essentially, this is basically 3 videos in one. It's kind of designed to be watched across multiple sittings, if that's your thing, and it can be watched entirely out of order. So feel free to skip around if you want. I realize there are some redundancies, but considering the nature of this video's structure, I hope you can forgive that. My goal is to make this perhaps a little more watchable than my Sonic X Shadow Generations video from last year, despite this video not being nearly as long. I don't think anyway, but I hope it encourages you to stick around for certain sections and to come back to pick up where you left off at your leisure. So anyway, without further ado, let's get into the video. Shadow of the Colossus and Breath of the Wild. Shadow of the Colossus epitomizes the best potential of the kinds of games that exist under the umbrella of PlayStation exclusives. PlayStation exclusives, as the years have worn on, have been, from my perspective, difficult to define, and I think that is part of the reason why PlayStation doesn't face nearly the same kind of criticism for them as Xbox has, where Xbox exclusives tend to fall within certain parameters which render them easy to categorize along distinct genre lines. PlayStation exclusives are mostly difficult to. As I mentioned before, action-adventure is a nebulous, vague genre that is used to refer to a variety of games that share only surface-level similarities for the most part. Thanks to this, the number of variations between different games in terms of gameplay and story is seemingly endless. While many games in this genre on PlayStation tend to mostly play things safe, it wasn't and still isn't always the case. Every now and again, we get a game that expresses itself in such a way in its narrative, gameplay, artistically, and technically that it demands attention. Shadow of the Colossus was one of those games. In contrast, Nintendo's exclusive games have had so many different variations in style, gameplay, story, etc., that the only defining feature of a Nintendo exclusive can be its characters. Nintendo has always been about offering truly unique experiences in gameplay across their games. Rather than simply making the same game twice and again ad nauseum, Nintendo has shown clearly that if there isn't a new idea to offer for one of their franchises, they would rather put it on indefinite hiatus than kill it slowly by releasing more of the same. This has been mostly the case, at least. During the unfortunate life of the Wii U, we saw what seemed to be a record number of Mario games released for it. The problem was that these Mario games tended to iterate on the same new Super Mario Bros. And Super Mario 3D sub-series of games, making the mainline Mario games on the console feel the least inspired of the series, especially in the wake of the Wii's much celebrated Super Mario Galaxy games. After a long wait and at the 11th hour of the ill-fated Wii U's life, its one and only proper Zelda game was delivered, The Legend of Zelda: Breath of the Wild. This was the big, innovative games that fans had been waiting for years. Breath of the Wild was a game that seemed to reboot the series in terms of its gameplay and story, and how they interacted. At the same time of its release, it was understood as something of a return to the series' roots, giving players an open world to explore and pursue whatever quests they wished in whatever order they wanted. It offered a truly non-linear progression, which gave players nearly absolute freedom, much like the first game. It was very possible to leave the tutorial area and immediately face down the final boss if you wanted, for example. This open-ended design wasn't universally accepted, and as more games adopted open-world designs for the sake of padding out runtime of their games, Breath of the Wild and its sequel, Tears of the Kingdom, have contingencies of Zelda fans who completely reject what they have to offer. A couple of years ago, while I was doing my initial playthrough of Shadow of the Colossus for my channel, someone was telling me how great they thought it was, calling it peak. But in the same conversation, Breath of the Wild was referred to by the same person as bad because it was an empty open world where all you did was fight bosses. This was incredibly confusing to me because, well, that description would have been a perfect fit for what Shadow of the Colossus is. So you can imagine my confusion caused by this seeming cognitive dissonance, but it sparked an idea. Why not compare these games? And thus, this video was conceived. So what am I comparing exactly? I will be comparing Shadow of the Colossus and The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild. I'll be comparing their gameplay and overall design to see how similar they really are. If they are both really empty open worlds where all you do is fight bosses, and see how different they are to the point where one can be considered peak and the other slop. I will not be comparing them to see which one is better. I don't really believe in that kind of comparison because it presupposes that the person conducting the comparison, me in this case, knows better about the games and what they ought to be than those who made the game, and I don't believe that kind of judgment is either insightful or interesting, since it is highly dependent on the person doing the comparison to begin with. I will be judging each game on their original native hardware. That means finishing each original version of each game. Shadow of the Colossus on PlayStation 2 and Breath of the Wild on the Wii U. The story of Shadow of the Colossus is one seldom experienced. The persisting stereotype of video game stories is, if a game is even purported to have one, it is assumed that the game's story is something along the lines of what game stories were in the early parts of gaming history, like Super Mario Bros. Or any number of arcade games. Thanks to this fact, and the fact that video games as a medium that requires interactivity in order to see stories play out, a lot of the time it can be quite difficult to illustrate just how profound video game stories can be. Shadow of the Colossus is one of those games whose story says so much by saying very little. It is very cinematic, but never shirks its gameplay in the service of its story. The two are intertwined in such a way that is artful and is also seldom seen in many games. I want to avoid doing a synopsis, but I want to illustrate my takeaway from Shadow of the Colossus' story. A few years ago, but still relatively recently, a number of YouTube videos came up talking about the story of Shadow of the Colossus and revealing the idea that those YouTubers got from it that Wander is the villain of the story. This is based around the fact that Wander sets off to take down 16 Colossi, some of whom don't even attack or fight at all. This fact implies that Wander is provoking the Colossi by taking their lives for his own gain, and in the cases where the Colossi aren't fighting back or can't fight back, in cold blood. I have a slightly different interpretation. Shadow of the Colossus is a game evocative of many different types of contradictory concepts. Strength and vulnerability, helplessness and ingenuity, resolve and hopelessness, righteous sacrifice and cold selfishness, fear and bravery, life and death, all encompassed under the game's prevalent and at times oppressive sense of gallant melancholy. Thematically, Shadow of the Colossus, to me, seems to be built around the seamless melding of equal opposite concepts that can be applied in various different aspects across the game's different scenarios. The player themselves, thanks to the game's level of immersion and attention to detail in its gameplay, is allowed to experience the story in a way that is communicated through the game's actual experience rather than being told the story outright. It's something that can really only be effectively communicated through the video game medium, as the story's reliance on offering a gameplay experience tailored to the playstyle of each individual player gives each player the tools to create their own adventure in spite of its linear progression. For me, I couldn't help but to feel as though I had to disagree with the consensus by some that Wander is the villain of this story. I actually venture to say that in the story of Shadow of the Colossus, there are no heroes, just victims of circumstance, and the only discernible villain in my experience is Dorman, who, even then, it's not so cut and dry. This whole story began with Wander and his quest to bring Mono back to life. Mono was sacrificed because it was believed that she had a cursed fate. Wander, believing this to be an injustice, discovered a way to bring her back to life. By stealing a mysterious sword and taking Mono with him and riding to the Forbidden Land, he hopes to seek out Dorman, a god who is understood to have the power to resurrect those who have died. He makes a deal with Dorman that if he restores Dorman's power by slaying the 16 colossi within whom Dorman's power had been sealed, he would resurrect Mono, but is warned that there may be strong consequences for this. From there, Wander travels the barren Forbidden Land, seemingly frozen in time, slaying each colossus one by one, unknowingly allowing himself to be further corrupted by the power of Dorman with the fall of each one. In the beginning, the Colossus fights are thrilling, finding the sigil on each Colossus while they buck and shake in an attempt to get Wander off of them, and watching Wander cling onto them for dear life, seeing his body fling about like a rag doll. The initial sense of helplessness gives way to a unique kind of power fantasy through ingenuity, as Wander is able to find and exploit the vulnerabilities of colossi that seem undefeatable. And while stimulating to the end in a gameplay sense, by the end of the game, the gallantry of the fights is progressively clouded by melancholy, with a tinge of regret that, while persistent through the whole of the game's runtime, becomes the strongest dominant feeling by the time Wander reaches the final Colossus. I think all of what the game and the Colossi fights are meant to symbolize are all encapsulated and represented by the nature of the fight with Evis, the 16th Colossus. It is the tallest of the Colossi, and must be approached from a distance and climbed to the very top of. Approaching Evis is harrowing. Evis fires highly lethal fireballs at Wander, and Wander must take cover in the ruins via trench systems, underground tunnels, and stone barriers to avoid being struck. The appearance of Evis is also incredibly intimidating, as Evis is a biological creature seemingly built out of ruins of some kind of fortress or temple. Evis has huge hands and a deep guttural voice, and is practically all-seeing, almost like the Eye of Sauron. Once Wander reaches the Evis base, climbing up is also a task of its own. While Evis doesn't attack Wander anymore, it still provides a challenge for him, since even the slightest movements by Evis can make Wander lose his footing and fall back to where he came. It's at the point when Wander reaches Evis's fur that the reality of this fight becomes clear. It's not really a fight anymore, if ever it were one. If you will allow me a tangent, Shadow of the Colossus is well known for questioning the morality of Wander's actions in taking down the 16 Colossi. Many have pointed out that a significant number of Colossi don't even become aggressive and don't even fight back. But I found myself taking this question a bit further. In H.G. Wells' War of the Worlds, one of the dominant themes of the story is that humans see the Martians and their tripods as machines of war, and, in response, activate their own war machines in hopes to defeat them. But there is a question of whether or not the feeling of war between humans and Martians is mutual. It is hypothesized in the story that the Martians are making room on Earth for themselves by eliminating humans, but not in the nature of a campaign typical of a war, but more so along the lines of an extermination, pest control. Perhaps these tripods and their heat rays are as much war machines to the Martians as a fumigator is a war machine to humans. Maybe a human walking through a spider's web can be seen by the spider as an act of violence, but is it an act of violence for the human walking through the spider's web? Thinking of Shadow of the Colossus then, by the nature of these battles, are any of these encounters really fights? If you were one of these colossi, how would you fight something that is so small and seemingly impotent compared to you? Some of them get aggressive, sure, and they do mean you harm in many cases, but it might be a little arrogant to call these encounters fights from our small vantage point relative to these colossi and what they could be potentially capable of. I say all that because once Wander grabs onto the fur of Evis and starts stabbing his various weak points to make Evis react in certain ways to make Wander's climb to Evis's sigil easier, Evis's reaction is more along the lines of a being trying to figure out what is causing it the pain it's experiencing. Wander stabs Evis's hand, and Evis stops to check why its hand hurts. Wander stabs Evis's arm, and Evis reaches with its other hand the wound as a reaction to the pain inflicted. Evis tries to shake Wander off its head like the other colossi, but Evis really can't do anything else. Is that fighting? Is that an act of violence from Evis's perspective? The colossi are terrifying. They resemble things that are familiar to us and to Wander, but their size and appearance is, at the same time, so alien and monstrous to us that it is hard to empathize with what they might be experiencing. They look scary with their masked faces and their piercing bright eyes, and yet we have to ask ourselves, what did they do to deserve being executed in such a manner? Exist? Wander is only doing this because Dorman needs his power restored in order to make Wander's wish to bring Mono back to life come true. Wander seems to believe that Mono's execution was wrongful, and that she was, by extension, robbed of her life. But in Wander's quest to restore her life, he then goes and robs 16 colossi of their lives for committing the sin of happening to come into existence by becoming the vessels for the power of a god that was sealed away long ago. In this case, do the ends really justify the means? If Mono knew that the restoration of her life would mean that 16 others had to befall the same fate she did, would she want to have her life resurrected? At what point do we identify Wander's actions as righteous when the cost of his quest is so great? From his perspective, not only does it cost the lives of 16 Colossi, but also his own, and even that of Agro, at least to him, his horse whose loyalty to him is immeasurable. Shadow of the Colossus' story plays out like a classic Greek tragedy, where the presumed hero pays a great unknown price in an attempt to defy fate or nature to service their own wishes. We have to wonder if Wander's intentions are really as righteous as he asserts they are, as the inherent nature of his actions seem from the perspective of his victims much more selfish. The fight with Evis demonstrates all of this as Evis, the biggest, meanest, scariest of all the Colossi, stops fighting and becomes helpless. All of this accompanied by a great storm, the sound of thunder, and an orchestra that no longer plays a heroic theme as Wander stabs his way to victory. I found myself, by this point in the fight, less thrilled and more possessed by the mechanical act of slaying this Colossus in the same way I did in the 15 preceding it. It is appropriate, since Wander himself becomes possessed by Dorman and learns a little bit what it's like to be a Colossus and fight human-sized enemies who are faster than him and can hit him from afar. As Dorman is sealed away, Wander is pulled into the vortex, fighting a hopeless battle against the wind current as he is pulled in, away from Mono to his fate, which ultimately ends with the Forbidden Land being permanently sealed away, leaving behind Mono, Agro, and an infant child who may or may not be a reborn Wander. There is hope, since life is proven to be able to exist in this land in the shrine, but it's tragic, since it's questionable that any of this really needed to happen at all. And it is that, along with the entire journey and its causes, that contribute to Shadow of the Colossus feeling like a heavy mix of a number of different kinds of thoughts and feelings. If you are someone like me, a game like this can leave you thinking about it for days after finishing it, and that is the sign of a powerful work of art. It takes a special kind of talent to say so much by saying so little, and using the video game medium as a means to tell that story in a truly meaningful and impactful way is something very few games have been able to accomplish. Shadow of the Colossus consists of a series of 16 boss fights. These bosses are, of course, the 16 aforementioned Colossi, and each of them require different means to take down. Each Colossus requires a player to pay attention to the combat scenario in order to identify each Colossus's weaknesses and exploit them in order to take them down. Since the Colossi can't be brute forced by simply chipping away at their health bar by stabbing or shooting random parts of them, the player is forced to use whatever elements of the Colossus and the arena's design to their advantage to find and exploit these weaknesses. In every fight, Wander brings with him both a sword and a bow, and with arrows. In some of the fights, Wander can also ride Agro to help him travel faster so as to outrun or keep pace with certain Colossi. The Colossi themselves are sort of one big puzzle. They each have very specific ways to defeat, and it is in finding these solutions where the fun of these fights come into play. Knowing their attack and movement patterns and identifying how they interact with their environment and you are the key to figuring out how best to dispatch them. Some colossi follow similar themes to one another, the Minotaurs A, B, and C, for example, but each increasing in complexity and difficulty from the last. A lot of these fights require Wander to grab hold of the colossi and climb onto them to their sigil, the mark of their weak spot. Wander can only grab onto parts of the colossi that have stone ledges or parts of the colossi that has fur. The catch here is that Wander has a stamina bar, which drains gradually as he climbs. Because of this, it's important that the player strategically mediates the use of stamina. Stamina is used whenever Wander is holding on to something by holding down the right bumper on the controller. As long as this is held down and the stamina bar has something in it, Wander can hold on no matter how violently the Colossus tries to shake him off. Because of this, it forces the player to moderate the use of stamina in these encounters, and letting go to recharge the stamina bar becomes its own strategy. The strength of Wander's strikes with his sword also has a degree of control. The sword is used by pressing the square button. When grabbing onto a Colossus, pressing the square button one time prompts Wander to bring up his sword and charge up his stab. The longer you wait, the stronger the hit, and the more damage Wander will deal. Of course, if a Colossus starts trying to shake Wander off, it will interrupt the attack, which will force Wander to charge up his attack again from scratch. There is a sense of strategy that comes with this, since quick hits might be more advantageous against certain bosses with shorter attack windows, but might take longer to take out as a result. Even the biggest colossi can be brought down with 4 to 5 strong strikes by Wander if allowed to charge fully, but it all depends on how good the player's timing is. But it's this aspect of the combat that helps give these fights a greater sense of thrill and excitement. Aside from the boss battles being structured a lot like puzzles and platforming challenges, the gameplay for Shadow of the Colossus, aside from them, is really quite simple. Simplicity does not mean carelessly designed, however. On the face of it, the huge open world of the foreign land is mostly empty. This might be thanks mostly to the hardware limitations of the PlayStation 2, but the vast lifelessness of this world is also thematically consistent with the game's story. So then, what's special about the gameplay in these sections between Colossus fights? To put it simply, finding the next Colossus. It has already been pointed out by a number of other YouTubers, but one of the main features about traversing this large landscape is the horse you came in on, Aggro. Aggro does not handle like one might expect from other games featuring them, like Ocarina of Time, for example. When Team Ico were developing this game, Ueda wanted to make Aggro feel as close to life as possible, and one of the key aspects of that design philosophy is that a horse's rider cannot directly control their horse as if it's just another part of them. Instead, Aggro is programmed to behave more like a realistic horse, where Aggro will react to your inputs with a similar reaction speed. Turning or navigating with Aggro isn't as precise, but at the same time, Aggro can guide herself around certain obstacles with no input required from the player. Aggro's speed is also determined by spurring her like a real horse, but Aggro will automatically slow down after a period of time, since she is subject to fatigue in the same way a real horse would be. This gameplay mechanic allows the player to have a better understanding of the feelings and experience of Aggro and see her more as a partner to Wander than as a tool. Aggro is also an extremely loyal companion, that will always answer to Wander's call. In some Colossus fights, aggro might be necessary to have the speed to keep pace with some of the later Colossi's attacks. Calling aggro will prompt her to answer and come to Wander's side almost immediately, making aggro's loss at the end of the game feel like a tragedy that's much greater than it already would have been. The act of finding the Colossi themselves, while made quicker with the inherently higher traversal speed thanks to aggro, can still be a bit of an ordeal. At first, finding them is pretty straightforward, but the deeper you get into the game, the farther away from the shrine the Colossi become, and the more roundabout the path to finding them gets. Wander's mysterious magic sword, when raised in an area lit by sunlight, will create 8 beams of light that, when pointed in the direction of the next Colossus, will converge into one. It is up to the player to travel across the world and to find the most probable route to that Colossus. Some of these later pathways can feel like they go on detours that take Wander in the opposite direction he's supposed to go in, but often the most direct path is either impassable or sends Wander off to an area of the world that is entirely different from where he is supposed to be. If you don't already know the way to the next Colossus, sometimes the trek to finding it can take longer than the actual act of slaying the Colossus itself. This journey is just as integral to the gameplay as the fights themselves, because it gives the player time to not only think about the journey up to that point, but also prepare themselves for what they might face in the next fight. Sometimes there are additional platforming challenges that come as a preamble to the fights themselves. This includes the first Colossus fight, which serves as a very complete tutorial for the rest of the game ahead. The world is huge, especially for a PlayStation 2 game. A lot of it is empty, but there are several subtle hints in elements of this world that quietly beckon the curious player to check it out. Sometimes it might not be anything special, and sometimes there might be a hidden secret or a hint to content that was cut from the game, or a reference alluding to some part of the mystery of the game's story or what took place before the events of the game. Oftentimes, these subtle hints are marked by vines, which Wander can grab onto and climb. While celebrated upon its initial release as being the most powerful video game console of all time when compared to the Dreamcast, these days you'd be hard-pressed to find anyone who is arguing that the PlayStation 2 was anything other than the weakest console of its generation. While it's true that it didn't have the kind of processing grunt to brute force its way through games like what would commonly happen on the Xbox to varying results, when games were built from the ground up for the PS2's highly specialized proprietary hardware, amazing things could be achieved. Silent Hill 2 is a great example of a game built specifically for the PlayStation 2, which was able to produce graphical effects that even the Xbox wasn't able to recreate, at least not easily, or accurately, or well. Shadow of the Colossus is another example of programming wizardry for the PlayStation 2. The fact is that a world of this kind shouldn't be possible on something like the PS2, not without significant sacrifices. Yet it exists. A lot of tricks were used to help keep the world in consistent view without using things to hide draw distance like the fog that persisted in the previous generation. This meant utilizing neat LOD techniques for objects in the distance whose properties would change depending on the player's distance from them. Open world games were still relatively new in this generation, And while there were still a good number of high-profile releases during this time, a world this vast that didn't rely on loading assets to and from hard drives or limiting visibility through aforementioned fog or limiting the number of assets in the world to begin with and keeping it all free of hitches caused by loading and keeping it believable and immersive is impressive. What's more is not only the sheer scale of the world and the environments within it, but also the Colossi themselves. The Colossi are large, animated, interactive objects in the world with fur that can only be rendered in this specific way on the PS2. There is something to be said about the sheer scale that many of these Colossi have, and if not that, then at least the physics that are employed in some of these fights, especially when it comes to destructible environments. They also employ pseudo HDR lighting effects that give the game a deceptively next-gen look, despite the fact that what is really happening is actually much more low-tech. On a technical level, Shadow of the Colossus is a real marvel, and the fact that the game is far more than a mere tech demo makes the game that much more a worthy late-gen killer app for the console. This all comes at a cost, however. As would prove a major theme through the next generation of consoles, the quest for pushing the boundaries in graphics would come at a cost of frame rate. Shadow of the Colossus suffers heavily in this aspect. The game targets 30 FPS, but it is regularly well below that target. Most of the time it seems to sit in the mid-20s, but during certain scenes involving the Colossus fights it can dip into the teens. This would likely render this original version of Shadow of the Colossus virtually unplayable for modern players. For me, however, while I can very easily notice the frame rate issues, I have a pretty high tolerance for poor performance. That's not necessarily to say that poor performance is okay, but I do find that in spite of the performance issues on PS2, the game is still playable if a little choppy in some areas. The game doesn't require quick actions, as its design is centered around careful observation and timing. Wander's movements being as slow as they are means that you aren't necessarily going to be moving like a pro Quake player at any frame rate in this game, so that's why it doesn't really bother me at all. Luckily, if you want Shadow of the Colossus at higher, consistent frame rates, the PS3 remaster and the PS4 remake are perfect options, especially the latter. Shadow of the Colossus is an immersive, story-driven experience, but that doesn't stop the game from adopting more gamey elements. One of the more surprising elements of Shadow of the Colossus is just how much replay value the developers added to it. Some people like to spend countless hours exploring the world and seeing all that it has to offer. But there is also a boss rush mode, a hard mode, and a hard mode for the boss rush. There are even completion times for the boss rush mode that you can go back and try to beat if you like. This is so unexpected and out of left field for me, mostly because games which are so heavily narrative driven like Shadow of the Colossus, I'm used to being a play through the story and move on kind of game. The kind of game that PlayStation exclusives have become famous for in the last decade. But for there to be an additional boss rush mode a la arcades or something is really cool, I think, anyway. The fact that they added trophies for these modes in particular has the achievement hunter part of me wanting to go back to the PS3 version of the game and getting the platinum trophy for it. That just goes to show how well designed the combat gameplay loop on its own is in the game. And for the developers to add a mode to the game like this one, seemingly made for players like myself, is a very welcome surprise. I love video games. I feel lucky to have been born into a time where this form of media, entertainment, art, or what have you can exist in the state that it does. While the business side of it isn't free from its own problems, I do believe that its better aspects still outweigh its worst. The games that have really brought these thoughts out of me in recent weeks have been Shadow of the Colossus and Breath of the Wild. Both of these games, in their own way, serve to me as some of the best examples of the expression of what games in the last 25 years or so can be capable of, both in narrative and a structural sense. And playing these two games back to back has only highlighted some of the best examples of game design, which games even now can sometimes struggle to reach for. It is curious then that when you bring up a game like Breath of the Wild, there are some people out there who really dislike it. As more of a casual Zelda enjoyer, as opposed to a long-time fan, my experience with Zelda games on the whole isn't really as extensive as many others. That, coupled with the fact that having been a lifelong Sonic fan has conditioned me to accept and adapt to new gameplay styles over successive years of games, has equipped me with an exceptionally low sensitivity to changes in gameplay philosophy and design. It's because of this that changes made in the recently released Doom: The Dark Ages from Doom Eternal in 2016 didn't bother me at all, and some of the backlash seemed to me a bit phoned in at worst and foreign to me at best. So you can imagine my surprise when, while I was doing my first ever playthrough of Shadow of the Colossus, someone said that Breath of the Wild was slop because it consisted of a huge, empty open world where all you did was fight bosses. Actually, I couldn't help but to see the irony in that fact. Seemingly without any awareness, the same person also got done saying how Shadow of the Colossus was peak when a huge, empty, open world where all you did was fight bosses used to criticize Breath of the Wild is a much more accurate, if not reductive, descriptor of Shadow of the Colossus. But it inspired the idea in me to go back and play through Shadow of the Colossus and to finally dust off my Wii U copy of Breath of the Wild to see how these games stack up to each other, chiefly to check how similar or how different these games are from each other. Shadow of the Colossus is cited as having inspired the design of a number of modern games, and Breath of the Wild is one of them. It's hard to argue against Breath of the Wild's naysayers with regard to its structure. In many ways, it seems that Breath of the Wild is kind of a working prototype for a game of its kind that somewhat satisfies those who have been wanting a non-linear Zelda game and completely abandons those who have been long since accustomed to the more linear structure of the most critically acclaimed games in the series. There has already been a really great write-up about this in King K's How Breath of the Wild Broke 3D Zelda, so I won't go too far in depth about this issue myself. But after experiencing Breath of the Wild from start to finish for myself, I can understand why it seems to have split the fan base over how a Zelda game ought to be structured. Breath of the Wild is a mostly free, open-world game where the story is completely guided by the player. The plot of this game, relative to many of its best-known and celebrated predecessors, is so sparse it is almost non-existent. Instead, aside from a mandatory prologue section, the game thrusts the player into the open world and sets you free with only a vague hint of direction on where to go next. There are main story quests, of course, and game completion does require the player to confront and defeat Calamity Ganon, but literally everything else is up to you. I do believe Breath of the Wild does get more credit than it really deserves by some people, since it does borrow a number of elements from other open world style games, especially those which were pioneered by Ubisoft, but it can't be discounted here that this is the freest Zelda game ever made up to that point. And ironically, it's this freedom that is the source of division among Zelda fans over this style of Zelda game. What do you do with this kind of freedom? That was the question I faced soon after setting out on my initially aimless journey. Eventually, I was taken by my sense of curiosity and immediately found myself setting off to chart the whole map, just as I had done in The Legend of Zelda Wind Waker, one of my all-time favorite games. I learned through exploration and discovery. My progression through the game was totally organic, and I learned by doing and trying. Collecting materials, mining minerals, selling them, buying arrows and armor, raiding camps, cooking, finding the Koroks, clearing shrines, etc. all came from interacting with the game, wandering through its world. Funnily enough, I never found myself worried about buying a horse for faster traversal. I felt that horses were too fast, and I might miss something of interest. If I needed to go to some far corner of the map, I could just fast travel to the closest point to it via a shrine or tower, so I spent the vast majority of my time in the game on foot. I believe it is this absolute freedom the game grants to players that serves as the largest barrier of entry for many. I even found myself wondering what exactly I was doing. Zelda fans have been so used to the structure of the previous games, and I don't just mean the story and dungeon structure, but the fact that those games have structure to begin with. They are very linear and have a set, predetermined path that gives players a clear set of expectations and goals to accomplish on their way to the end of the game. Breath of the Wild shirks this idea almost entirely. It's almost like going through one's whole life being in school and being accustomed to the structure of a regular school schedule, only to graduate and be out in the real world on your own. At first, you have that honeymoon phase where it's like summer vacation again, but then it turns to fall and it's October now, and you start wondering what you're doing with your life. I had a very similar experience with Breath of the Wild. At first, the experience of roaming a seemingly endless open world had me in awe. There was so much territory to cover, so many mountains to climb and rivers to cross, and every journey between towers while charting the map was like its own full adventure. After a while, though, I began to wonder if what I was doing in the game was helping me get closer to defeating Calamity Ganon. I did eventually unlock the quest for the 4 sacred beasts, and those were instrumental in helping me defeat Calamity Ganon as a result, but even with solving the shrines, I found myself wondering what all of it was for. I began to get the feeling that Link wasn't growing much stronger, as even as I got deeper and deeper into the game, the Guardians and Mini-Guardians seemed undefeatable, as one mistake led to a one-shot death. I was left wondering how I could possibly defeat the final boss if these little guys could be such a formidable force. Later in the game, I quickly realized that I had accidentally entered into the most difficult mini-guardian shrines first, when I was ill-equipped with no inventory upgrades and primitive weapons. Once I had more experience with the game and its combat, unlocked more weapon inventory slots, and took a more holistic approach to the utilization of all the weapons at my disposal, combat with these enemies became easy. So easy it felt more like I was clowning on them. Easily my favorite thing to do with the mini guardians is to stun lock them with elemental weapons and totally break their attack patterns. Combat against bosses ended up being a lot simpler than I had previously prepared myself. It seemed to be a recurring theme with games for me this year where the best combat strategy is to get right in the face of the enemy and attack relentlessly. That was the case with AI Limit, Doom the Dark Ages, and with The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild. While I've heard there's an underlying strategy for taking out these bosses, the 4 of which are associated with their respective sacred beasts, the boss fights don't really seem as though they meaningfully utilize the game's combat mechanics, despite the way combat is tutorialized in the beginning. You could use a perfect dodge and parry mechanics, but it kind of seems unnecessary when it is usually just as effective in a number of cases to get too close for the boss to hit you and wail on it. These bosses really could be over in a matter of a couple minutes if you know what you're doing. And while there is an additional step with Calamity Ganon, even the final boss is pretty easy to just aggro into submission. It isn't bad. These bosses can seem intimidating and impossible to approach so closely, but once you figure out that you can, unmitigated aggression is the winning strategy in Breath of the Wild, which is kind of weird to say considering how much more careful the combat strategy of its immediate predecessor, Skyward Sword, is in contrast. All things considered, it's still pretty simple, but simplicity doesn't mean bad. Parrying is done with Link's shield, if he has one, and perfect dodges are performed at the right moment during an enemy attack. Both have the same effect. Time slows down and you are prompted to attack, and Link can get several attacks in while the affected enemy is unable to respond. I found that I almost never used the parry thanks to the weapon breakage mechanic. A successful parry will damage your shield, and since a perfect dodge is safer and has the same result, I found that it was better to preserve the life of the shield and not use it to parry enemy attacks. One of the advantages that came with playing the Wii U version of this game was that it supported gyro aiming for the bow and arrow. When it comes to precision aiming of ranged weapons, sometimes analog control, especially without aim assist, can be very difficult, slow, and unwieldy. I can't speak for the Switch port, so I might be wrong about this, but with the Wii U gamepad, you are able to help make your aim more precise through its gyro controls. Its implementation is actually quite cool. You can't use the gyro controls as a replacement for aiming, I know because I tried. Instead, you are meant to use the analog stick to point Link's target reticle in the general direction of a given target and use the gyro to fine-tune the aim for greater accuracy. In some cases, it can make boss fights even more of a cakewalk. The Zora boss, for example, fires ice blocks at you, and they can only be deflected by firing arrows at them. What made this section really easy was using the bow and arrow and aiming only using the gyro controls. It allowed me to just swivel my chair in the direction of the incoming ice block and take it down, almost like an automated sentry turret. It was surprisingly immersive and very fun to execute. I couldn't imagine fighting that boss any other way. When you learn to use the bow and melee weapons synergistically is when the game's combat flow leaves you feeling like a master even if you aren't. Since Link's strength stats hardly change, even with the combat buffs some armor upgrades give him, approaching combat situations requires a certain level of tactical thinking, and when you finally have your per scenario tactical thinking down and you're able to execute it successfully and reliably, it really is a great feeling. I think that's what makes Breath of the Wild's combat loop so effective, fun, and satisfying despite what flaws it might have. Breath of the Wild is a difficult game to talk about because of how all of its gameplay elements are so closely tethered to each other. But I want to discuss the open world more specifically. As I said before, Breath of the Wild offers the player absolute freedom to roam its world at their own pace. Unfortunately, Breath of the Wild came out at a time where this kind of game, which offers a vast, expansive open world, was becoming the norm in the AAA space especially. And a lot of the time, those open world environments seemed more as a means to pad out the game time rather than actually offer anything substantial to the player. Most of the game time then was spent traversing a vast, empty, open world rather than actually doing what was important to the game. When it turned out that Breath of the Wild was going in a similar gameplay direction with a vast open world where players were expected to freely explore and seek out different quests, many reacted in dismay at the fact that this was going to be more open world slop, so to speak. And some people did try it, saw enough similarities between what was on display in Breath of the Wild and other open world games they didn't like and wrote it off as bad. Many of these people specifically would probably accuse Breath of the Wild's open world as being vast and empty. While they are entitled to their preferences, and it's perfectly fine to not like whatever they want, their description of the open world would only be 50% accurate, objectively speaking. The world is vast, but it is far from empty. Of course, open worlds in modern game design tend to be used as a crutch for developers who wish to pad out their game's runtime. It is seemingly easy to make an open world, but there is a certain art to making a good open world, and I think that's where the distinction between what people feel is filler content as opposed to something substantial for the gameplay experience. When I was playing through Breath of the Wild's world, I couldn't help but to feel as though there were a plethora of factors taken into account when designing this version of Hyrule. It is definitely the largest world in any Nintendo game to date, and yet it never feels short of things to do or places to see. It's easy to call a world of this size empty, but really that isn't true. At the same time, it isn't overcrowded with things or characters. Instead, I found that this world strikes a balance between open space and populated areas that, dare I say, is artfully executed. I guess it isn't entirely fair to compare it to a game 9 years its senior, but since it's my only relevant point of reference and it's still relatively fresh in my mind, Breath of the Wild's open world design shows just how far open world design and quest or mission structure have evolved since the days of Far Cry 2, for instance. In Far Cry 2, almost every major mission location is in the same place across its 2 maps, and they are all at completely different parts of the map from each other. When you are given a mission, it will almost always point you to the farthest location from your current one on the map. Hence, the time spent traveling to that location, especially if you're not using fast travel, can really be seen as nothing other than padding. Unless you really like traversal and don't mind fighting your way through the same militia camps over and over again, coupled with the fact that sneaking around them is almost impossible a lot of the time thanks to the fact that most of the roads are flanked by steep, unclimbable cliffs and mountains, the game runs a high chance of becoming tiresome after a pretty short time relative to the story. Breath of the Wild sees these kinds of problems and comes up with solutions to them. The freedom you are granted means that you aren't beholden to a rigid narrative structure that forces you to take on certain missions or quests. Its free-flowing design allows the player to pick and choose which quests to pursue based on their own preferences and at their own convenience. Since you can go anywhere within this map, you don't necessarily find yourself forced into combat scenarios if you don't want to. This is a lifesaver, especially if you find yourself under-equipped in the beginning of the game and you see guardians patrolling in your direct path to the place you want to go. Fast traveling mitigates the need for on-foot or horseback travel, which can be extremely useful in the later part of the game. Like Far Cry 2, Breath of the Wild also respawns enemies. Breath of the Wild is sort of forced to do so mostly because of the fact that weapon degradation could potentially run the risk of exhausting the world of its weapons, in theory. But it's also important to enemy level scaling as well, so that as Link acquires stronger weapons, the player never finds enemy encounters to be too underwhelming. It also makes farming powerful weapons possible, thanks to the fact that mini guardians also respawn at the shrines. And since they drop powerful guardian weapons, it makes refighting them worth your while if you find yourself in a pinch. If not for those, then you also have the option to farm mini guardians and regular guardians for their parts, where you can craft various guardian weapons and armor as well. As we'll see later, these multiple solutions for how to attain or re-attain weapons after they've broken will become somewhat of a recurring theme. Weapon breakage in Far Cry 2 is a bit more forgiving than Breath of the Wild, but once your weapons break, your only real viable solution is to find the nearest gun storage area and get a new one. You can pick up the weapons of fallen enemies, but these weapons will already have degraded significantly and do not last very long as a result. Back to the topic of respawning enemies, Far Cry 2 really doesn't have much of a reason for why enemies and their outposts and encampments return after being completely destroyed just a few minutes before. This is a common critique of the game, and I can understand both critic and developer as to the reason for this phenomenon and the way it affects player immersion, respectively. Breath of the Wild cleverly avoids this issue by having enemies periodically respawn over the course of a few days or so when the red moon appears. Not only do enemies simply respawn in their areas, but enemy types and strengths typically evolve based on some in-game metric that is measured, but I can't quite pinpoint, though I'm pretty sure it's tied to the number of enemies you've slain during that time period. This kind of gives Breath of the Wild an interesting RPG feel, since enemies are growing in strength alongside the player's skill at the combat and their ability to take out enemies. Since Calamity Ganon's presence is a constant looming threat, it isn't out of the question that his increasing influence would lead to the re-emergence of his underlings throughout Hyrule through some magical influence. This detail gives the open world in Breath of the Wild a sense of immersion and believability that makes it feel important for the player to continue to explore and learn more and always stay on their toes and be prepared so that new encounters don't catch them by surprise. I know I just did a mini comparison there between Far Cry 2 and Breath of the Wild, surely one of the strangest mismatched comparisons I would ever do, but Far Cry 2 being my frame of reference as opposed to something like Assassin's Creed, Red Dead Redemption, or heck, even Far Cry 3 or 4, I think illustrates the origin of my appreciation for the quality of the design of the open world in Breath of the Wild. It can't be easy to make an open world game, and I think writing games off simply because they use this kind of design isn't entirely fair, especially when it is clear that it is well designed. There is just enough wide open space in Breath of the Wild to give the player a while to breathe in relative calm, and there is enough in either direction from the player at any given time to help keep the game feeling like an active, living environment and provide the illusion of being a dynamic world. I say illusion just because, for the most part, little of what Link does if he follows certain quests has any real effect on the world or the people living in it that aren't directly involved in the process, but, whatever. The last note I want to make about the open world design is the variable weather conditions. My first encounter with variable weather in an open world game was with the rainstorms in The Legend of Zelda Wind Waker. I always loved sailing the seas at night and in storms. Something about the sound design, the sound of the rain beginning to fall and becoming heavier with the sound of rising winds and thunder approaching in the distance, all made for an incredible and peaceful experience. But if there was one thing about thunderstorms in particular that was conspicuously missing from Wind Waker, no doubt due to hardware limitations of the time, thunderstorms on the high seas were not at all dangerous, unlike in real life where they can be hazardous for sailors at sea. Bringing the hazards of thunderstorms to life in Breath of the Wild then makes perfect sense. What's also amazing about Breath of the Wild is the fact that you can actually see the approach of storm clouds long before it reaches you. You can see the formation of clouds in the distance, start to rain, flashes of lightning in the distance, and approaching sound of thunder as sunny weather turns to overcast, to a light drizzle, to a heavy rain, to a downpour and thunderstorm. The fact that this is all happening on the Wii U, which even in its time was pretty outdated hardware compared to the rest of the industry, it's impressive just how much is being done on this machine. But what makes these storms hazardous? Well, now lightning can strike you.
You're kidding me! Riding full speed, the lightning hones in on you and it hits you? You see, this isn't fun. I'm sorry.
If Link has metal equipment on him, he is very much susceptible to being struck by lightning and dealt pretty hefty damage. Of course, avoiding this risk is as easy as unequipping metal equipment, but it is a pretty cool addition to the game and helps add somewhat to its light survival style exploration gameplay. My only complaint about the weather is that the thunderstorms and rain in general seems to be a bit too long. This is a problem simply because it renders steep slopes and sheer cliffs as very slippery, which makes them significantly more difficult to climb. It might sound like a small issue, but some objectives can only be reached by climbing to a higher place. And while you can boost your stamina to the point where you can brute force your way to the top of some obstacle by the end of the game, more often than not, you will find yourself exhausting your stamina and falling such a distance as to totally nullify any progress you might have made. The rain lasts such a long time and is so frequent that sometimes it can be a bit of a hindrance to progression that feels a bit cheap at times. Even if you fast travel to other parts of the map, it can still be raining there. It isn't horrible or renders the game unplayable or anything, but it is a bit troublesome in many cases. Speaking of climbing and stamina, one element of gameplay that carries over controversially from Skyward Sword is Link's stamina meter. This stamina meter activates when Link performs certain actions like sprinting, climbing, or using his glider. This is a controversial addition to the gameplay, and while I can see where the complaints are coming from if they are saying that the starting amount of stamina is too little, I don't know what other kind of solution there can be other than a stamina bar. Some people say it shouldn't exist, but I feel like that would make the game too easy. If you can run, glide, or climb endlessly, doesn't that kind of kill any sense of challenge or character progression? Games like this have to place some limitations on the player somehow, lest they cheese their way to the end by abusing a lack of reasonable restrictions. After all, one thing about games and the way they are designed to begin with is that players are forced to abide by certain rules. In chess, for example, it's not like someone can just move their king from one end of the board to another in a single move. I mean, sure, that can be physically done, but at that point, you aren't playing chess anymore. Wiping all of your opponent's pieces off the board doesn't make you the winner, nor taking your knight and just knocking your opponent's king down on your first move either. There are certain restrictions placed on the movement of each of the pieces in chess, and it's up to the player to work around those restrictions to win the game against their opponent. Video games are really no different. For a game like Breath of the Wild, it's clear that the development team wanted to give players true freedom to go where they want to, the way they want. This avoids running into the problem that persists even in today's open world games, and especially games like Far Cry 2, where its open world feels more like a world of various hallways you can traverse thanks to the aforementioned unclimbable cliffsides that often flank the roads and rivers you traverse. But to avoid the game being too easy and to add some kind of realistic element to the character to give the player something to improve over time, I believe that the stamina gauge is necessary to balance this freedom out and add some kind of challenge to the exploration aspect of the game. One critique mentioned about numerous previous Zelda games before Breath of the Wild is that in many, but not all cases, the games would go through protracted periods wherein the story seemingly goes on pause. This is in spite of the implied urgency of the situation. I think this is especially the case for a game like Wind Waker, when you have to go and collect the Triforce charts. Breath of the Wild has received criticism for its story not being as grand or as significant as the previous games in the series, and on the face of it, that might make sense, but upon further examination, it kind of falls apart. It might seem there is less story content in Breath of the Wild, but if you play through it the way you might a conventional linear Zelda game, its story content really is about the same. The only difference being that because the world is so open and vast, more time is spent engaging with it rather than the story, rendering the game less dense in story content as previous Zelda games. Instead of writing out a grand story for the player, Breath of the Wild, consistent in its open world, freedom-granting gameplay direction, leaves the story of the hero up to the player and their actions and how they navigate the game to write for themselves. The way the game is structured, it's clear to me that Breath of the Wild's primary means of storytelling is totally player-driven. I can't help but to feel that the nature of this design is similar to something like survival mode in Minecraft, or at least old Minecraft. Because you are given so much freedom upon leaving the Great Plateau, unless you go straight to Hyrule Castle to defeat Calamity Ganon, you really can do whatever you want. What you, the player, chooses to do after the Great Plateau, more than anything else, is the story. For some people, this kind of freedom seems aimless, and as a symptom of laziness on the part of developers who can't be bothered to write a story for players. On the other hand, however, this is seen by some as an opportunity to experience the world at their own pace, and experience it as a real adventure, like pioneers forging into uncharted territory laden rich with secrets waiting to be discovered. I found myself in awe at times climbing to the top of a mountain, looking out over the rest of the world, seeing a distant peak on the other side, making my way there, summiting that peak, looking back at the place I came from and imagining that I had traveled all that distance in real time. I remember the first time I looked out over the Gerudo Desert and saw the sacred beast lumbering mechanically in the distance, its head peeking over the sandstorm that enveloped it. It had my imagination running wild, and not only that, but also had me taken aback by the fact that the Wii U was rendering such a large moving object from such a distance. It's clear the development team really put their maximum efforts into making a rich world whose exploration offers a seemingly infinite number of ways to explore and new things to discover. Because Zelda keeps Calamity Ganon at bay with her powers indefinitely, Link can take all the time he wants to rediscover the world he was sealed away from and had long since forgotten. I'm going to be totally honest and objective here, but I constantly found myself getting completely entranced and immersed in this world. It brought back similar feelings I had about exploring the Great Sea in Wind Waker, both when I was a kid and as an adult. I'm the type of person who, every playthrough I do of Wind Waker, charting the entirety of the Great Sea is an absolute must. The game would feel incomplete if I don't, and being able to rediscover and explore the islands scattered throughout the sea to uncover their mysteries, find their treasure, and even speculate on what that island used to be before the formation of the sea was all part of what made Wind Waker such a watershed gaming experience for me. Breath of the Wild functioned exactly like that, except now there was more freedom, more opportunity, more wonder, and environmental storytelling, and more danger. All of this creates a highly enticing adventure that is easy to spend countless hours experiencing. I'll be honest, it's not common for games to hold me for long periods of time. For me, the usual cutoff point for a single session is about 3 hours or so. When a game can hold me for longer than that and not feel like it is that long is usually a sign for me that the game is doing something very right. That isn't to say that games that don't are bad, but there is a certain level of inexplicable extra that comes with holding my attention for 5 hours without my realizing that much time had passed. It's not a rare occurrence, but it is uncommon enough that when it does happen, it catches my attention. My first playthrough of Breath of the Wild was in the ballpark of 50 hours. Initially, I thought it would be possible to record all my gameplay by only focusing on the core quests of the game's storyline. This proved impossible, since as soon as I was unleashed on the world, I immediately felt compelled to go in the direction of the next tower to activate it. Then the next, and then the next. Soon I made it my purpose in the game to chart the entire map before doing the main quests. In the interim, I did countless shrines and other shrine challenges like the giant maze, or my favorite, the island off the coast where you're supposed to survive without your usual gear and activate all the keys. Hopping from town to town, inn to inn, biome to biome, it never stopped being enthralling. Having to rethink my route to some place I want to go due to a lack of resources, being too low leveled and terrified of the guardians patrolling exactly in my path also made things more exciting. I really liked paying attention to the patrol routes of the guardians from a distance to find the best path to avoid them, and the panic from being sighted by a patrolling guardian that I didn't notice ensured that I would always be on my toes. It forced me to be careful when approaching points of particular interest, especially as I entered territory closer to Hyrule Castle. There are so many wonders in Breath of the Wild, it's impossible to mention them all. And I have to admit, I kind of had to rush to the end of the game just because I wanted to free up time to play Doom the Dark Ages when I finally received it at launch, since that day was fast approaching at the time. Securing myself the Master Sword and deactivating the Sacred Beasts became my top priority, not necessarily because I wanted to, but because it needed to happen in order to free up time. I can't play two big games like Breath of the Wild and Doom the Dark Ages concurrently, Both games each have such a time demand that, while great news for me, also means that they would both be vying for time that I unfortunately don't have. Thus, eventually, I did need to beeline it to the end eventually and take on Calamity Ganon, but I didn't do so feeling underprepared. I had adventured enough and discovered and learned enough to feel confident in my ability to take on the challenge to defeat the great evil of Calamity Ganon once and for all. Because of its vast open world and everything included in it, Breath of the Wild has a unique sense of replayability that cannot be ignored. Even after finishing the game, I still found myself thinking that I wanted to go back and find more shrines and collect more Korok seeds and do more of the side quests. Not for the achievements, there are none on Wii U after all. Not for any distinct in-game rewards, but purely for the intrinsic reward for satiating the curiosity this world inspires. Writing about Breath of the Wild is hard because it is really easy to lose where you are, where you've been, and how to proceed. Distilling the game down to its different elements as though they can be divorced from each other would make writing a script discussing the game a lot easier to organize and keep track of. But thanks to the game's open-endedness and how fundamentally integrated all the different elements of its gameplay are, it makes that divorce impossible. Much like my approach to the game itself, this script too allows itself to wander and have its original intentions for certain paragraphs changed at the mention of some previously unforeseen aspect whose importance necessitates discussion. I guess it's possible to just discuss the plain content of the game, but my previous attempt to do so in a now scrapped script proved to me that that was impossible. Everything in Breath of the Wild comes back to its open world and free-flowing design, and thus I find it only appropriate that this script mirror that, at least in spirit. Going into this game, despite what I knew about it, I still didn't really have any real expectations. Aside from not having any real clear idea of how long it would take for me to finish the game, Breath of the Wild had its hooks in me to an extent that only the newest Doom game could rip or tear me away from it. For me, that is not insignificant and is a sign of a game that really resonated with me. 2025 has been a year where most of the games I've played so far have involved fast action and unrelenting aggression. Aside from Shenmue, only Breath of the Wild has encouraged me through its design to slow down and enjoy the little moments throughout its world. I actually really enjoy the minimalist soundtrack. I believe it adds to the magic of its environment. I know many would probably argue that the Zelda magic has been lost in this modern iteration of Zelda, but I find it to be more of a change in the kind of magic rather than an attempt to maintain the magic of what it has clearly abandoned. I don't want to rely too much on this kind of descriptor, but in a lot of ways I couldn't help but to get a strong Ghibli-esque vibe from Breath of the Wild's soundtrack. Not only from the minimalist tracks, but even in some of the rearranged versions of older tracks. I find the use of the Rito Village theme, which is a rearrangement of the Dragon Roost Island theme from Wind Waker, to be especially Ghibli-esque, without teetering on the edge of mimicry that I find plagues certain soundtracks from Atelier Ryza, for example. I also want to shout out the new rendition of the Zora Domain theme from Breath of the Wild. One of my favorite themes from the Zelda franchise comes back in a modern form that transforms it just enough to give its Breath of the Wild iteration its own identity, while still preserving as perfectly as possible the original mysticism that came with the Nintendo 64 original. It is a flawless translation, and I really can't get enough of it. In 2025, it's hard for me to imagine that the visionary team whose existence at Nintendo and I assume we all took for granted is coming to an inevitable end. It's almost certain that before the Switch 2 sees its own successor, the names and faces of Nintendo and those who had contributed so much to the legacy of its characters and games will be retired. In retrospect, Breath of the Wild seems to me like something much closer to the original intent of the first game than any of the games released previously. It's been repeated countless times, but The Legend of Zelda was conceived to be an emulation of exploring one's surroundings, being among nature, and the awe it often inspires. Thanks to technological constraints, this wasn't really all that possible, although we did have glimpses of that intent in some games leading up to Breath of the Wild. Despite the Wii U being technologically well behind its competition, Nintendo's designers and engineers have always seemed to have had a knack for getting out of their hardware what few are able to get out of hardware more powerful. Despite the Wii U being nominally more powerful than the Xbox 360, Breath of the Wild at least gives the appearance that it might be even more capable than the specifications on paper might suggest. Breath of the Wild, of all the games in the series up to now, seems to be the purest expression of the series' original intent, the concept that brought it into existence. Since Zelda had largely set a tradition of a different style, of course, not everyone accustomed to the structure of 3D Zelda will be very receptive to it. But I can't help but to feel that the creation and delivery of Breath of the Wild after years of development and a number of delays must have felt to the series' visionaries as something of a dream come true. Maybe this was what Zelda was always intended to be? After all, how many different permutations of the linear Zelda style could you make before you start running out of ideas to keep every subsequent game feeling fresh? Eventually, things need to evolve. The technology was there, and the timing was right. And after all the effort, Breath of the Wild was released and set the stage for the future of the series. This might be a divisive move on their part, but if Tears of the Kingdom is any indication, I'm glad to see that negative feedback isn't enough for them to backtrack on their vision for their games. Comparing these two games is tricky. When I went into this video, I had originally assumed that this comparison would be a lot simpler, but as I wrote about them, it became clear that this initial assumption was false. Shadow of the Colossus and Breath of the Wild are both very similar and very different, and illustrating them in a cohesive way is, I have to admit, an exercise in tedium, if doing it well is the main concern, of course. The comparison points aren't as much of an issue as the question of where to start is. But I guess the best place to start is with the question of structure. Structure between these two games are mutually inverse. Shadow of the Colossus follows a very strict, rigid structure, whereas Breath of the Wild has almost none. Not all open worlds, after all, are necessarily free or sandboxes. Shadow of the Colossus does have an open world where you can explore freely through it, but progression is strict and linear. You can't fight the Colossi out of order. Even if you know where the last Colossus is, there is no chance that you can fight it in any other place in the sequence other than the last. This might be a little immersion breaking, I suppose, since the world implies that these colossi are all wandering the world at the same time, so you might think that going to one of the later areas earlier will show this respective colossus there. Doing so, however, will only reveal to you that the colossus that should be there hasn't even spawned in yet. This is likely a symptom of hardware limitations, but this is one aspect of the game that, unfortunately, has no choice but to fall short of its ambition. Is this a big deal for fans of the game? Probably not. Should it be? Personally, I don't think so. But I point this out to illustrate the fact that the game, although open and inviting exploration, isn't free and progression is locked to a strict linear structure. Breath of the Wild is entirely different. The only real semblance of structure in Breath of the Wild comes from the Great Plateau tutorial portion at the beginning of the game. While many fans of the game's open world nature are probably not totally fond of this rigidity on subsequent replays, for a first playthrough, I can see how this structure is necessary for tutorializing in a smaller contained part of the larger world what exactly is going to be expected of you once the game turns you loose on the rest of the world. Funnily enough, this initial part of Breath of the Wild might also have given the game's non-fans a false sense of what the game would end up being like, since this Great Plateau section is not an unsubstantial chunk of time in the game, and many were probably met with surprise once the game releases you into the wild with only vague instructions of what comes next. This might have felt like a bit of a rug pull for some, so the backlash against the game by some fans hoping for something like Twilight Princess or Ocarina of Time on a grand scale is understandable to some degree, at least. But as I mentioned before, the design of this world is truly free. You are encouraged to explore, to try climbing things, moving objects, cutting down trees, or mining rocks for minerals to trade for money. Forage for food, cook, shop, glide anywhere. This world is your oyster, and there are virtually no restrictions to where you go and when you choose to go there. Very little, if anything at all, is locked behind the need for a certain weapon or power or tool. Even if the game presents you with a challenge which requires a certain weapon or tool that you don't currently have, that doesn't necessarily mean that you can't find some other way around the problem. But Breath of the Wild presents you with challenges whose answers are more open-ended than any other Zelda game that came before. The freedom you have in this game, then, isn't only in the open world and your choice of Sacred Beast order, but also in how you solve certain puzzles in the world and its shrines. That isn't to say that there is absolutely no freedom in Shadow of the Colossus. While its progression is fixed and inflexible, many of the Colossus fights are more open-ended. Each Colossus can be taken down in a variety of different ways, and the speed and skill with which you defeat them all depend on experimentation and how daring the player can be. This is specifically when it comes to how the player interacts with the game's physics. Not all of the fights, mind you, have this more open-ended design, at least not from my experience, but for some where it is necessary to climb up to the top of a Colossus to reach its weak point, finding ways to utilize the game's physics when the Colossus tries to shake you off can be really fun and make the boss fight more exciting than if you played extremely carefully. There is, of course, a risk versus reward aspect to this, which can make attaining victory thanks to taking these risks that much more satisfying. It should also be noted that while Breath of the Wild's bosses can go down quite easily by getting in their faces and attacking them relentlessly, there is still a surprising amount of freedom to your approach to them. I mentioned before in the Breath of the Wild section that the combat in this game is at its best when you learn to utilize the whole range of your powers, abilities, and weapons holistically. In a lot of cases, this is emphasized during the boss fights. I really like this approach to the game's combat design, since while there is, of course, one fixed way to defeat enemies, it doesn't always have to be entirely by the same exact means. While mechanically different from each other, both Breath of the Wild and Shadow of the Colossus allow for a certain level of freedom in one's approach to the boss fights. Getting back around to the question of structure, Both games offer varying degrees of structure in slightly different forms. Where Shadow of the Colossus has a completely rigid linear narrative-driven structure the player is forced to follow, Breath of the Wild offers suggestions for quests the players might be interested in pursuing before taking on Calamity Ganon, but it is entirely up to the player to make the decision to pursue those quests if they want. Shadow of the Colossus has a script for the player to follow. Breath of the Wild provides a scenario, playground, and equipment with some bits of narrative ties to quests that are, by a vast sum, optional. In a micro sense, there is a bit more flexibility on the side of Shadow of the Colossus when looking at some of the individual boss fights. Breath of the Wild's bosses and shrines might seem much more rigid, but years of player experimentation testifies to the fact that their solutions can be a lot more creative than the developers had intended. But structure isn't the only aspect of these games that are in contrast to each other. Let's talk about open worlds. I know I've already spent an inordinate amount of time discussing open world games in this video, but when you're talking about open world games and comparing them, I suppose that should be expected. Just don't Control F my script for open world if the concept is offensive to you, assuming you made it this far into the video already. About open world games, it's become popular in recent years to disparage the open world design philosophy. This is anecdotal, of course, but I've been told that a lot of people seemed to have attributed the rise in open world games with the success and popularity of Breath of the Wild, and that if it was an open world game, it was directly because of that. It almost seems as though there are people out there that assume Breath of the Wild invented the open world genre as we know it. That, of course, couldn't be further from the truth. Indeed, open world games have existed as a game design philosophy for a longer time than you or I probably could imagine. I bet there's an early Ultima game that probably did it first, considering how almost everything seems to go back to that series in some way. Anyway, open world games have more or less been in the mainstream for about 20 years or so, so of course, the idea that Breath of the Wild had something to do with its core developments is a little absurd, especially considering our other subject, Shadow of the Colossus, could very well be considered in the same genre. I don't know if people really consider Shadow of the Colossus as a proper open world game considering its railroaded linearity for progression. But just because its progression is linear doesn't necessarily mean that the world is designed to funnel the player to the next objective. Much like in games like the Grand Theft Auto or Elder Scrolls series, the story will have you go to certain locations, but when or whether you choose to go there or not is entirely up to you. You could go to location A to progress the game's plot, or you could detour to another section of the world you haven't explored yet just to see what's there. Pick up a side quest, and you're on your way. Shadow of the Colossus operates much in the same way. The beams of light will give you your waypoint, but you don't have to follow it. Whether you take the time to explore or not is all based on satisfying some intrinsic reward or payoff. Maybe there isn't anything where you're going, but just the act of discovery could be a reward enough for the player. Of course, the remaster, and I suspect the remake as well, of Shadow of the Colossus offers extrinsic rewards for doing a couple of things that previous explorers of the game have enjoyed, but I can't help but to feel like those rewards were placed there because of how dedicated so many were to things like climbing to the top of the temple in the world or to visit the ruins where you can save the game. The world of Shadow of the Colossus is so shrouded in mystery in its environmental storytelling that it compels the curious to travel in yonder direction and see how far it goes and where it will take you. This is all in spite of the fact that Shadow of the Colossus's world is mostly empty. This, of course, is symptomatic of hardware limitations of the PlayStation 2. Even a world this full of mostly empty space required certain major optimization compromises to be made in order to make this work. But just because it's empty doesn't mean it's poor. As mentioned previously, it is thematically consistent with the game's story, but in its function, I think it is because of this emptiness that it piqued the interest of so many. This world must have some secret it's hiding, and even if unintentionally, because of the game's open design, players over the years have managed to uncover many of those secrets, and I think that must be indicative of a world that is well designed. On the other hand, Breath of the Wild's open world coupled with freedom to roam at your own pace as a central part of its game design, we find a very different situation. Many accuse Breath of the Wild for being an empty open world, as I mentioned earlier. That is objectively untrue. Breath of the Wild encourages exploration through its environment. Rather than being plot-driven or using mystery to compel players to explore its world, Breath of the Wild offers a space that beckons the player to explore certain areas through a promise of some kind, be it an item, a shrine, or even a nice view. I don't know, but if I'm in a large open world wherein I can travel anywhere with little restriction, when I see a mountain peak, you bet I'm going to travel whatever distance it takes to summit that mountain. Even if there's nothing there, just to turn back and look at the view is a reward enough for me. And I reckon many others, even if there's nothing at that peak to collect or use or puzzle to solve, it's the same for them. Breath of the Wild banks on the idea that players will want to have a look around, to see the sights, and travel every path they can. I would venture to say that Breath of the Wild is a quintessential example of its story and structure being about the journey rather than the destination. Story beats and plot-specific cutscenes are almost entirely optional and actually must be unlocked in a number of cases through the act of exploration and ideally are discovered organically. It is a highly manual experience as opposed to the more automated scripted experience offered by previous games in the series and many other games, even open world ones. Its non-linearity and free and fluid progression is exactly what makes it completely distinct from the open world of Shadow of the Colossus. And because of this, while Shadow of the Colossus's open world is vast and empty in the interest of narrative consistency and technical limitations, Breath of the Wild contains more. There are roaming enemies, enemy encampments, inns, towns, and of course the main cities, shrines, and sacred beasts. There is a lot of content within the wide open spaces. They are just empty enough to offer areas of relative calm with areas where things are going on. There is a lot of balance in this playfield, and thanks to the enemy respawn system, eliminated enemies can remain gone for relatively long periods of time before they are replaced by stronger enemies in their place. It avoids the weird immersion-breaking respawning of enemies in previous open-world games, but also has a difficulty scaling based on the number of enemies dispatched between respawning periods. It's a very well-designed and well-thought-out mechanic that, when combined with the world and its various weather conditions, terrain, biomes, etc., makes for a highly engaging experience that helps the player construct their own Legend of Zelda through an active engagement with the environment in stark contrast to Shadow of the Colossus. In the sense of open worlds, then, it's safe to assume that they are practically the inverse of one another in terms of their world designs and what they are intended to emphasize in terms of their relation to story progression and player interaction within the world. The similarities between them ultimately relies on how the player elects to interact with it. It's based on whether or not the player will take the initiative to interact with these worlds in a more active way than simply seeking out the means of progressing the story. That being said, doing so in Shadow of the Colossus doesn't exactly run the risk of the player missing out on large swaths of content, unlike in Breath of the Wild, where the player will miss out on a lot of aspects of the game that, while not necessarily crucial to the in-game story per se, does run the risk of the player coming away with the impression that the game is quite hollow compared to other Zelda games. In that sense, unless you are doing a repeat playthrough and want to try speedrunning your way to the end of the game really begs for the player to interact with it more deeply than past games in the series. One of the really interesting things about these two games is the horse mechanic. Again, I didn't really spend very much time on a horse in Breath of the Wild, but that doesn't mean I avoided them entirely. One thing I noticed about traversing the world on horseback in Breath of the Wild was that, while not exact, it does closely emulate the horse riding mechanic of Shadow of the Colossus. Unlike in previous Zelda games where you control your mount directly, Breath of the Wild treats the horses similarly in that you can only really guide the horse. While the horses in Breath of the Wild handle in a way that is probably more accessible, the fact that it takes some direct control of the horses away from the player can have its influence traced back to Shadow of the Colossus, which was a real pioneer in that regard. When it comes to combat, both games take very different routes, as one might expect. Shadow of the Colossus combines puzzle platforming, timing, stamina management, and risk versus reward in terms of attack strength. Climbing enemies and seeking out their weak spots takes up more of the battle than the actual use of weapons, and thanks to this, on top of the boss variety, the boss battles are always interesting to figure out. Shadow of the Colossus provides the player with two weapons you can use depending on the scenario, a bow and arrow and a sword. The sword can really only be used to stab the weak spots of enemies, and the bow can be used to hunt birds or to get the attention of or stun a Colossus. Your sword is always strong and your bow never runs out of arrows. I say that because combat in Breath of the Wild takes on a radically different system. Weapons can break, even the Master Sword apparently, though I didn't dare test that. It's too precious in my mind. Weapon breakage is a pretty widely disliked aspect of not only Breath of the Wild, but any other open world game that utilizes it. But it really didn't bother me so much simply because, well, I came from Far Cry 2. Weapon breakage forces players to strategize what weapons they wish to use and when they wish to use it. As you progress through the game, the weapon breakage system can really stress the pretty paltry stock inventory slots that are initially available to you. But as you expand your inventory by exchanging them and other perks with Korok seeds, the less an issue I believe it becomes. Further, you can actually craft your own Guardian class weapons at a workshop by giving machine parts to the relevant character, who can then craft these weapons on your behalf, which can mitigate spending excessive amounts of time searching the world for dropped or discarded weapons that are likely weaker anyway. You can buy or collect bows, for which you must also purchase arrows to use with. Bows can also wear down as well, and have differing rates of wear depending on the materials they are made from. All of this forces you to look at your collection of weapons and figure out your combat approach holistically, something you didn't really have to consider at all in Shadow of the Colossus. Since there are regular enemies, combat happens a lot more frequently, and you are presented with a number of different ways you take those enemies out. But be it stealthy, from a distance, full frontal assault, or what have you, the possibilities are endless. Boss fights are more about exploiting enemy attack patterns and weak points and using your various weapons to make the most out of those moments when the boss is vulnerable. This is in contrast to climbing them and looking for their weak point. While stamina plays a big role in Breath of the Wild, its emphasis diminishes significantly, if not entirely, during combat scenarios. In this case, you could say that the stamina mechanics of each of these games are also mutually inverse. There is a much stronger emphasis of survival in Breath of the Wild than there is in Shadow of the Colossus. In Shadow of the Colossus, your only incentive to interact with the world, aside from traversing it to get to the next boss, is wholly reliant on what you want to do, since there are no real demands by the game in any of its systems to get the player to do any more than to simply cover ground. Breath of the Wild has a strong focus on survival, and thus the player is kind of forced to interact with the world to at least some degree. Survival can mean anything from picking your battles, cooking meals, resting at inns, climbing mountains, forging rivers, etc. Traversal is a journey, and because of how populated the world is, simply covering ground to a specific location isn't really how the world in Breath of the Wild works. Shadow of the Colossus points you in a direction, and while the world might seem vast and open, the pathways you end up taking to your destination do end up turning into linear ones as you travel further. In contrast, the open world in Breath of the Wild is actually open, and as a result, there are a seemingly infinite number of different ways you can reach your intended destination. Their stories are the exact opposite of the other in terms of emphasis, but shockingly similar in their execution. The oppositeness comes from the fact that one depends heavily on a strongly driven narrative that guides the gameplay, while one has a mostly absent story, save for some important, albeit optional, watershed moments. The similarity comes from the fact that the stories are weaved in seamlessly with the gameplay, even though the way you interact with them is a little different. Shadow of the Colossus has you play out the story most of the time, taking the role of Wander as you set out and regrettably slay the Colossus in an attempt to bring the girl back to life. The game doesn't spend very much time taking control away from the player, so even in the section where Wander fights the whirlwind sucking him in, it is all interactive. Breath of the Wild's story too is interwoven in the gameplay. Your gameplay is the game's adventure. Yes, there is lore if you seek it out, but the whole journey to building Link up to get to the point where he can face down Calamity Ganon, and he can free Zelda from her makeshift prison, keeping Calamity Ganon at bay. Every decision, every side quest, every action you take is meant to be the bespoke adventure of the player. Link is your avatar, and the world is your oyster. In both of these cases, despite the way you interact with these stories being a bit different, the story and gameplay in both of these examples cannot be easily, if at all, divorced from each other. Should I even mention performance? I'll keep it brief here. Breath of the Wild on the Wii U handily gives you the better experience, and it's not even close. While many have said that Breath of the Wild plays better on the Switch, from what I've seen from past Digital Foundry cross-platform tests, performance across both platforms is essentially the same. The dropped frames happen on both consoles, but in different scenarios, indicative of each platform's own strengths and weaknesses. The Wii U plays Breath of the Wild brilliantly and is a great playable experience. It's especially impressive that a lot of the game data is being streamed from the disc. In stark contrast, Shadow of the Colossus has performance that these days people would call pretty abysmal. If I wanted to make a clickbait video, I could say that the original PS2 version of Shadow of the Colossus is literally unplayable in current year, but I couldn't do that. Shadow of the Colossus was a demanding game of its time, and while it did showcase just how far the PS2 could be pushed in graphical terms, it was at the expense of performance. The game targeted 30 FPS, but would not hold that frame rate during more demanding scenes. So we're looking at N64 frame rates, hovering in the 20s to as low as the low teens. Luckily, the game was designed around this issue, so it looks a little smoother than it otherwise would be, but these days, modern players would probably have a very difficult time acclimating to this original version of the game on original hardware. In a world now where we have the PS4 remake, there isn't much of a need to go back to this, but for me, it was the original masterpiece everyone praised, and as someone who loves experiencing these old original versions of games as sort of artifacts of their time, I enjoy it. That is a long way of me saying that performance issues in Shadow of the Colossus, for me, is a feature, not a bug. I suppose I should move on to the conclusion of this whole comparison. I have to admit, I don't think anyone was really ever comparing these games directly to begin with. Mostly, this was inspired by someone lambasting Breath of the Wild by giving it a description more suitable for Shadow of the Colossus, which was a game they were calling Peak. Is Breath of the Wild a game where you just wander through expansive empty spaces to fight bosses? No, clearly that's not the case. That is the case, however, for Shadow of the Colossus. At the same time, however, Shadow of the Colossus was highly influential for its time, and that can be seen in a number of different games, Breath of the Wild being one of them. The influence of Team Ico's games reaches very deep, especially for games which are as recent as they are. Instead of climbing colossi to find their weaknesses to take them out, instead you are climbing onto the sacred beasts, navigating them like dungeons to activate them and defeat the forces controlling them. That is, of course, if the player chooses to do so. It's a dead horse, but the biggest contrast here is about freedom and linearity. Shadow of the Colossus has one track and one track only. The replay value comes from its various post-game challenges, as well as experiencing the story again, maybe at a higher difficulty. Breath of the Wild is totally free. You have freedom to do whatever you want. It's even more free than other open world games like Grand Theft Auto, for example. It is full to the brim with content you could pursue should you choose to pursue it, but it's up to you. Ultimately, these are very different games that have very different gameplay directions, but coming from similar places. That's what made this comparison so interesting to me, at least. And if you made it this far, perhaps you found it interesting too. If you liked this, let me know your thoughts in the comments. Maybe give me a sub if you really liked it. But more than anything else, I hope you can go back and enjoy whichever of these games you happen to prefer. Or both if you liked both, like me, because when you do that, well, You're retromaxing.